Hello everyone. My name is Satin, and I'm gonna present about one documentary which name is Finding Down, and which is directed by Kristen Wells. He is a well-known filmmaker, and in this story, it shares the stories of indigenous women in Canada who have disappeared or been killed. It shows what they went through, and the difficulties they faced. And the film mainly take place in Canada, and it looks that problem of indigenous women going missing and being murdered. Also, it examined various places across Canada where these cases have happened to show that this issue is widespread. And Finding Down was released in 2006. Also, the documentary covers stories from both the past and the present to show that this problem has been ongoing. In the documentary, the focus on the crisis of indigenous women disappearing and being killed in Canada. There's, it tells their stories and the stories of their families. Moreover, it highlights the series issue of violence, discrimination, and unfairness that indigenous women both on and on of indigenous land face. The documentary aims to make people more aware of this problem and address the big issue in the system and the fight for justice for the victim and their families. Also, it emphasized the needs for society to change and stop the violence and discrimination that indigenous women experience. Uh, Now, I'm gonna talk about the how this story will help us. The Finding Down real stories, interview and deep storytelling to show what indigenous women and their family go through. The film combines personal stories, facts, and interviews with experts to provide a complete and emotional look at the issue. It tells powerful stories and asks viewer to take action, encouraging them to support change and justice for indigenous women. Finding Down is a strong and emotional documentary that deeply explores the problem of indigenous women disappearing and being killed in Canada. It calls for change and justice, showing how urgent it is to address these serious issues. Okay, now my friend Arpit will gonna present about next slide.
Thank you, Jatin. Now I will tell you about the historical context of the film. Well, this documentary, Finding Dawn, is directed by Christine Welsh in 2006, which reveals the traumatic history of the indigenous people in Canada. It delves into the enduring impact of the colonization, the legacy of the residential schools, which shows us the indigenous children were abused and suffered, and the discrimination faced by the indigenous communities. Well, the history of Canada is marked by the lands which were occupied by the indigenous people in the past. They were forcefully removed from their lands, which were given to them by their ancestors, which led to the loss of their culture. The children or offsprings of the indigenous people were taken from them and placed in the residential schools where they were abused, and there were no one that would make them feel safe, and they felt neglected, which led to the erasure of the cultural identities. Well, in Canada, Indigenous people have faced discrimination in various levels of life. There was no justice system for the things that they were facing living in the country. For decades, Indigenous women have faced violence, including domestic violence, sexual assault, homicide. There were many cases which were for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which no one cared or done anything to save them. Over the years, there have been many movements and efforts which were made by the indigenous people to draw the attention of everyone to the discrimination they were facing. And these efforts of them have contributed to the awareness of the people and also advocacy for change. Finding Dawn highlights the systematic discrimination of the indigenous women and the violence which were happening against their women and the need for awareness of the people living in the country and social change to make this ongoing crisis and discrimination they are facing known to the people and protect their rights and lives of the indigenous women. Thank you. Now my friend Vineet will tell you about some connections with the course materials and other sources.
Thank you, Arpit. And now talking about the film, we all know that the film is an exposure of issues and of murders and missing cases in Canada of the indigenous women, and the connections with the course materials and the external references we have. We can talk about many things like indigenous rights, indigenous rights, gender studies, feminism, cultural justice, criminal justice, criminology, human rights, uh, indigenous filmmaking and studies about the filmmaking and all. But today we'll stress on three topics, that is indigenous rights, criminal justice, and gender discrimination. Coming to the indigenous right, in the film culture, in this film, they clearly showed the difficulties faced by the indigenous women and the challenges they were facing, which were against the indigenous laws and indigenous ways of living. So, in a report given by United Nations of Canada, it was stated that the committee was so concerned about the issues of the violence and against of the violence against the indigenous women and the violence against the people of indigenous culture about their land rights and all. And this was clearly stated by the UN Human Rights Report about the Canada, about how Canada is failing to ensure that indigenous people are having good connections with their laws and proper well-being. And moving to the next slide, we'll here we'll talk about criminal justice. In this documentary story, he clearly showed that how the people in Canada are misusing the justice, and and the Department of Justice had clearly informed that injustice had been faced in indigenous by indigenous women, and indigenous women are also the most likely to be victim for any kind of crime like sexual assault, physical assault, or robbery than non-indigenous women. Coming to this picture, we can clearly see that the difference between other women in Canada and indigenous women who have been affected, there are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other woman in Canada. And coming to the next slide, here we'll talk about the gender-based violence happening in Canada. In this film, we can see that violence occurring against women and girls of indigenous people is shown. This problem is not only in the case of film, it's all over Canada, and indigenous women and girls are greatly overrepresented among long-term and unresolved missing cases and murders. And this was a statement given by Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and there were also movements like Stop Violence Against Women and Stop Gender-Based Violence going around Canada, especially in Vancouver. And not only these three, we also have so many other topics to talk about, like feminist theory. In this film, they clearly showed that uh, intersectionality of gender, race, and all. And they also showed us the human rights and international laws, which were which were not into considerations, like which were not getting a proper consideration in Canada. And yeah, These are the scholarly sources that can be connected to this story, and the presentation will be continued by Rajpreet. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinit. Today I am going to share my personal experience related to the film. The film I watched was very sad and it was very hurt. Why that happened? Indigenous people live were destroyed by kidnapping and murders. Many of the women were missing from their neighborhood and her body couldn't resolve the mystery. And the Canadian government should take some measure to give prioritize indigenous women and aware all over the country that once there was a mystery of missing indigenous women which never got solved. There should be awareness regarding this big unsolved mystery by making students study in their chapters. And not to forget that Canada is Indigenous people's land. Justice should be given to the oldest community of what they want. Through law should be made in favor of the community and there should be bigger punishment for the people who go against the community or harm themselves. And while watching this film, I was of so sorry for the injustice and of the world. And this movie also encourages us not only to observe but also to take action to address the issues it arises. It encourages us to participate in the solution and promote positive changes. And this movie also talk about on events such as the Women's Memory March held annual in Vancouver demonstrated the resilience of the communities along Highway 60 which come together to bring about change and justice. And now Gunjot will take over.
Hello, everybody. Today I will share some experience in relation to the film. Christine Wells made a documentary about Indigenous women in Canada who were missing or murdered. The film is emotional and shows the sad situation these women face. Wells uh, tells their stories well, making us see them as real people. The movie talks about the problem these women face in places like Vancouver, the dangerous highway of Tears and Saskatchewan, where crime against them are not solved. It tells us about the unfair things Indigenous women go through. This documentary is not just to make us aware, but also to ask for fairness and positive changes. Wells' work is important to start conversation and make people work together on this problem. Thank you.